How dangerous is freedom of speech? A recent media firestorm erupted when CBS host Margaret Brennan claimed in an interview that Nazi Germany had weaponized free speech to facilitate the Holocaust. Her remark was met with fierce backlash, particularly from free speech advocates, including Vice President J.D. Vance and Fox News commentators, who ridiculed the idea as historically illiterate. Their rebuttal was straightforward. Nazi Germany did not weaponize free speech. It crushed it. The Third Reich was defined by censorship, propaganda, and brutal suppression of political opposition, not by any excess of free expression. On the surface, this seems like an open and shut case. Brennan's critics argue that her claim falsely suggests that unregulated speech was responsible for Hitler's rise, when, in fact, the Nazi regime thrived on repression. But this response sets up a straw man. It assumes that the only way speech can be weaponized is through direct state control, ignoring the social dynamics that allowed Hitler to manipulate public discourse long before the Nazi government formally imposed censorship. Likewise, Brennan's defenders have not adequately clarified what they mean. If the argument is that free speech as a principle led directly to the Holocaust, it is indeed a sloppy, historical claim. However, if the point is that the collapse of democratic order in Weimar Germany was accelerated by the way political actors used mass communication in a time of crisis, then the discussion is far more nuanced. Both sides of the debate miss a deeper truth. Free speech, like tolerance, is not an absolute force that always leads to freedom. Its function depends on the conditions in which it operates. What happened in Weimar Germany was not a simple case of too much or too little free speech. It was an illustration of how, in a fragile democracy, communication can become a destabilizing force when public trust, economic security, and political legitimacy are absent. Tolerance is often treated as an unquestioned virtue, a defining characteristic of democratic societies. It is seen as the antidote to oppression, the moral foundation that allows diverse groups to coexist peacefully. But this belief assumes that tolerance is an absolute good, equally valuable in all contexts. This assumption makes the so-called paradox of tolerance appear inescapable. Should a society tolerate those who would dismantle it? If it does, it risks tolerating intolerance to the point of self-destruction. If it does not, it becomes intolerant itself. This dilemma has long frustrated philosophers, policymakers, and citizens alike. Yet, it is a false dilemma, built on a misunderstanding of how tolerance actually functions. Tolerance, like free speech, does not exist in a vacuum. It is not a fixed principle with uniform consequences, but a contingent practice, whose effects depend on the conditions in which it operates. Weimar Germany, a case study in the collapse of tolerance. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy, was born from the ruins of World War I. From its inception, it faced severe economic crises, political extremism, and a deeply divided society. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy, was born from the ruins of World War I. From its inception, it faced severe economic crises, political extremism, and a deeply divided society. In times of stability, tolerance can reinforce itself. But in Weimar Germany, conditions of economic devastation and political fragmentation made tolerance fragile. The post-war settlement humiliated Germany, burdening it with massive reparations that led to hyperinflation in the early 1920s and mass unemployment after the Great Depression. These crises fueled a sense of national decline, making many Germans feel that their way of life was under siege. Tolerance in this environment was not seen as a virtue, it was seen as a weakness. Democracy became associated with chaos, and pluralism became a scapegoat for national suffering. This set the stage for extremists, particularly the Nazis, to exploit public discourse. They were able to freely spread conspiracy theories about Jewish influence, democratic betrayal, and communist plots, all while presenting themselves as the only force capable of restoring order. Free speech in this fragile democracy did not act as a marketplace of ideas leading to truth. Instead, it became an amplifier of resentment, legitimizing violence and radicalization. As the Nazis gained influence, political conflict escalated. Leftist and right-wing militias fought in the streets, and moderates were increasingly sidelined. Political norms eroded. Each act of extremist rhetoric justified a counter-response, reinforcing an escalating cycle of radicalization. This is the real paradox of tolerance, not a theoretical contradiction, but a predictable social dynamic. When tolerance and free speech exist in a stable society, they are self-reinforcing. But in a society where groups perceive themselves as fighting for survival, speech is not merely an exchange of ideas, it is a weapon. By the time the Nazis took power in 1933, the mechanisms of democracy had already been weakened. Hitler did not need to destroy a strong, functioning system. He needed only to push over an already crumbling structure. The Nazi suppression of free speech that followed was not an abrupt reversal of German political culture. It was the culmination of years of escalating political warfare, in which speech had become a tool for destruction rather than discourse. What Weimar Germany teaches us is that free speech and tolerance are not absolute forces that always lead to democratic stability. Their effects depend on context. In a stable society, where people feel economically secure, politically represented, and culturally respected, tolerance is self-reinforcing. Under these conditions, pluralism does not feel like a threat, but a natural feature of a prosperous society. In a society facing existential insecurity, tolerance and free speech can become accelerants of extremism. When groups feel their status is slipping away, they do not simply voice grievances, they seek to suppress, exclude, or eliminate perceived threats. This creates a feedback loop of counterintolerance, escalating political violence and destabilizing democracy. If we accept that tolerance and speech are not inherent goods but conditional ones, then the solution is not to endlessly debate their limits in the abstract, but to recognize the material and social conditions that make them viable. Applying this lesson today, the Weimar case is not just history, it is a warning. Today, we are witnessing similar patterns of economic anxiety, political polarization, and media-driven crisis narratives. The question is not whether we should have more or less free speech, but whether our institutions are strong enough to handle the discourse they enable. Germany today has laws restricting hate speech precisely because it has learned that in a fragile democracy, unregulated speech can be a pathway to authoritarianism. The United States, with its absolute commitment to the First Amendment, faces a different challenge, ensuring that free speech does not become an accelerant for democratic collapse. In the end, the Brennan controversy is not just about historical accuracy, it is about how we understand the role of speech in shaping society. The lesson of Weimar Germany is not that free speech caused the Holocaust, nor that censorship is the answer. It is that speech is a force shaped by its environment, and when democracies fail to ensure stability, even their highest ideals can become instruments of their undoing.